The Shadow on the Balcony, a scary story from Reddit. Subscribe to Scary Stories Vault for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. The evening started like any other. Emily had just returned from a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet night in. The small apartment she rented had become her sanctuary, a cozy space that offered her peace after the chaos of the city. Located on the second floor of an older building, it had a quaint balcony that overlooked a narrow alley lined with trees and the backs of neighboring homes. From her vantage point, she could see into a few dimly lit windows, though no one seemed to notice her presence. She set down her bags and sank into her couch with a sigh of relief. The muted glow of the television and the hum of the city below created a sense of comfort as she sipped her tea. It was early autumn, and the air had begun to cool in the evenings, a crispness creeping into the apartment through the slightly cracked balcony door. That night, Emily planned to unwind. She didn't have much on her agenda beyond watching a few episodes of her favorite show and curling up with a good book before bed. It had been a stressful week, and she needed the solitude. Her phone buzzed occasionally with messages from friends, but she ignored them for now. Tonight was about disconnecting. But then, around 9:00 p.m., she heard it. It was faint at first, just a rustling sound outside, like leaves being blown across the balcony floor. She glanced toward the door, but saw nothing unusual. A small breeze had picked up, and she assumed it was just the wind. Shrugging it off, she returned her attention to the TV, her mind quickly forgetting about the sound. Minutes passed, and then there it was again, this time louder. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the wind. It was more deliberate, like the sound of footsteps on the balcony outside. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She sat up and muted the TV, listening intently. The noise continued, faint but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was outside. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation. It couldn't be a neighbor. Her balcony was only accessible from inside her apartment, and it was far too high off the ground for anyone to climb up. Maybe it was an animal, a stray cat or raccoon, but the weight of the footsteps felt too heavy for that. She stood up slowly, her feet barely making a sound as she moved toward the balcony door. Her pulse quickened with each step. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment, staring out into the dark. The balcony was shrouded in shadows, the dim city lights casting only the faintest glow across the space. With a trembling hand, she pulled back the thin curtain and peered through the glass. At first, she saw nothing. The balcony appeared empty just as it had been earlier, but as she squinted, trying to adjust her eyes to the darkness, a movement caught her attention. There, in the farthest corner of the balcony, was a figure. A tall, shadowy figure. Emily froze. The figure was unnaturally tall, too tall to be a person. Its head nearly brushed the overhang of the balcony, and its body seemed to blend into the shadows, making it impossible to make out any distinct features. It was standing perfectly still, facing her apartment, as if it were watching her. Her breath caught in her throat, and her body went cold. She stepped back from the door, her mind screaming for her to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. What was it? Who was it? The rational part of her brain told her it couldn't be real, that it had to be a trick of the light or her imagination playing tricks on her. But the pounding of her heart told her otherwise. As she stared, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, looming, its presence almost suffocating. Emily wanted to scream, to do anything to break the tension, but her voice wouldn't come. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the figure was staring right into her soul. Finally, her survival instincts kicked in. She grabbed her phone and backed away from the balcony door, keeping her eyes locked on the figure. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed 911, and the seconds it took for the call to connect felt like an eternity. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. There's someone on my balcony. Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're just standing there watching me. I don't know who it is." "Ma'am, are you in a safe place right now?" I'm inside, but I don't know if they can see me." "Stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way." Emily nodded, even though the dispatcher couldn't see her. She moved farther away from the door, her eyes darting back and forth between the shadowy figure and the apartment around her, as if something else might suddenly emerge from the darkness. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. Every sound in the apartment seemed magnified. The creak of the floor, the hum of the fridge, even the ticking of the clock on the wall. But through it all, the figure remained unmoving, its presence like a dark stain on her consciousness. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only 10 minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Emily's relief was palpable, but she didn't dare let her guard down. She hurried to the front door and unlocked it, waiting for the police to arrive. When they did, 2 officers approached her apartment cautiously. She pointed to the balcony, explaining what she had seen. They exchanged glances before one of them stepped forward and opened the balcony door, flashlight in hand. Emily held her breath, watching as the officers scanned the area. "Ma'am," he said after a moment, "there's no one out here." Her heart sank. That wasn't possible. She had seen it. She knew she had. It had been standing right there, staring at her. How could it be gone? "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice shaking. The officer nodded. "There's no sign of anyone. Are you sure you didn't just see a shadow or something? It's pretty dark out here." Emily felt a surge of frustration and fear. She knew what she had seen. No, it was a person or something. It was standing right there in the corner. The second officer, who had been checking the rest of the apartment, spoke up. "There's no sign of forced entry, and nothing seems out of place. Maybe you were just seeing things?" Emily shook her head, but the doubt had already started creeping in. Was it possible that her mind had been playing tricks on her? She was exhausted after all, and the shadows on the balcony could easily distort shapes in the dark. But even as the officers reassured her that there was nothing to worry about, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The officers left after a while, advising her to lock up and call again if she saw anything suspicious. Emily thanked them, though she still felt uneasy. She locked the balcony door and drew the curtains tightly, shutting out the darkness beyond. For the rest of the night, she barely slept. Every creak of the apartment made her jump, and she couldn't help but glance at the balcony door every few minutes, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing there again. Days passed, and Emily tried to convince herself that it had all been a mistake, a trick of the mind, but the unease never left her. Every night, she found herself glancing at the balcony, waiting for the shadow to return. And then, a week later, it did. It was late, well past midnight, when Emily woke with a start. The apartment was silent, but something had pulled her from sleep. She lay still for a moment, listening, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the balcony. Emily's blood ran cold. She turned her head slowly toward the balcony door, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the same corner as before, was the shadowy figure. It was watching her. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure was real, and it was tall. So tall that its head nearly touched the top of the balcony door. Its body was dark, almost blending into the night, and though Emily couldn't see its face, she could feel its eyes on her. Terror gripped her, and she bolted upright, grabbing her phone from the bedside table. She dialed 911 again, her hands trembling so badly that she almost dropped the phone. "There's someone on my balcony," she whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but Emily could barely hear her over the sound of her own heartbeat. She gave her address again and begged for the police to hurry. But this time, as she watched the figure, something changed. The figure moved. Slowly, it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed directly at her. Emily's breath hitched, and she stumbled out of bed, backing away from the balcony door. The figure didn't move from its spot, but its presence filled the room, suffocating her with fear. The sirens were distant, growing closer, but still too far away. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. One moment, it was there, looming over the balcony, and the next, the space was empty. The sirens blared outside, and the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the apartment, but there was no sign of the shadow. The officers searched again, more thoroughly this time, but once again, they found nothing. Emily didn't know how to explain it to them. She didn't know how to explain it to herself. All she knew was that something had been there, something that didn't belong in this world. In the weeks that followed, Emily moved out of the apartment. She couldn't stay there anymore, not with the memory of the shadow haunting her every waking moment. Even now, in her new place, she still finds herself glancing at the balcony, waiting for the figure to return. Because deep down, she knows it's still out there, watching.